Hello and welcome to our presentation today on the employee experience using the employee lens to attract, retain, and engage your workforce. My name is Charles Rogel and I'm the Vice President of Products and Marketing for DecisionWise, and I'll be the moderator for today's presentation. Our presenter today is Dr. Tracy Malin.
Hi Charles, good to be here. Hello all, thanks for the opportunity, I appreciate it.
Tracy is the CEO of DecisionWise and he holds a doctorate degree in organization change from Pepperdine University and also an MBA from Brigham Young University. He is the co-author of the book Magic, 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Employee Engagement. And he also works with executive teams from around the world to improve the organization culture and drive performance. DecisionWise has been in business since 1996. We specialize in conducting employee engagement surveys and also measuring and improving the employee experience. This webcast is scheduled for 60 minutes. Everyone is on mute, so if you have questions, please use the question tool to submit them, and we'll try to address them as we go. This webcast has been approved for 1 hour of recertification credit through HRCI and SHRM. After the presentation, I'll send an email that includes the program codes to redeem this free credit, along with the links to the slides and other downloads. You can also download the slides and other samples in the handout section on the toolbar right now. So if you access the toolbar, you'll see the slide deck there. Go ahead and download those along with us. So Tracy, to begin, let's talk about this idea of customer experience as opposed to employee experience.
Sure, I'm excited about this because we want to introduce a couple of new concepts here. One of those, obviously, the idea of customer experience is not anything new. We've seen it in particular over the past decade. This continued emphasis on the idea of let's focus not on customer satisfaction, but what really is the overall customer experience. What is the customer dealing with on a regular basis? And unfortunately, a lot of this has been focused over the past little while on what are we doing wrong when it comes to the customer, what's going wrong. And the reason I say this is because when we think of customer experience, we think of really what's going on in terms of, am I having a good day with this customer?
Yeah.
So it's really focused on what's going wrong with this experience we're having.
Yeah, because they always want to measure, okay, was like the restaurant clean, or was your service fast, or, you know, so where was there a breakdown in the process?
Absolutely. You know, I had a poor customer experience a while ago. I won't go into a lot of detail on this. It was about a month ago. And one of the things I value quite a bit is feedback. Obviously, we're in the feedback business. So I sent just a quick email saying, hey, I'm not looking for anything on this one. It happened to be with a sporting goods store. I'm not looking for anything. I just thought as a professional you'd want to know what's happening in your store, and here's the experience that I had. And I immediately received a reply back. It had to have been within 45 minutes, and it was from the store manager who had also copied that store manager's boss, so copied his boss's boss, and said, Dr. Malin, we'd like to invite you back into our store. That wasn't the experience that you should have had. Let's get it taken care of for you. So really what happens is we are focused on both the positive customer experience and the negative customer experience. And we have all kinds of horror stories when it comes to the customer experience.
Yeah.
Now we have a lot of organizations that are today, both the organization itself and also providers or vendors that they're contracting with to measure that customer experience. Now this webinar is not about the customer experience, but we wanted to start with something that we all recognize, and that is the idea of what experience I have as a customer. Let's start with a couple of different ideas here. And this was some really interesting research that Charles, as we went through and we found what some of these things are.
Yeah, so 59% of 35 to 34-year-olds say they share poor customer experiences online.
All right, I don't fall into that age group, but I would still share a poor experience with people that I knew. I'm not the kind of person that would go and post that on Facebook or Instagram or anything like that, but it's still, I write reviews. I know that you write reviews about some of the things you've had, and it's become a lot more easy to post those reviews when it comes to the customer. In fact, let's look at some other statistics.
So after a negative customer service experience, 58% will never use the company again, 49% will tell friends not to use the business, and 34% say they would take revenge posting a negative online review.
Now, I would absolutely not say I take revenge here, but what I certainly do is I will, if I read a book and it's a very positive look in terms of what I experienced, I'm going to let folks know if I buy a product that's not a good product or is a good product, I will post a rating.
Yeah.
But 34% say not only do they post a rating, but they're also going to go in and they will actually post a negative review and take revenge. So this is a little different than posting
a revenge review.
A revenge review, exactly right.
And then after a positive experience or customer service experience, 69% would recommend the company to others, and 50% would use the business more frequently.
Yeah, these statistics are interesting because these have changed over the last decade or so. 69% would recommend the company. So this means that I would go out, and the company may be a product as well. Mm-hmm. I would go out and say, hey, Charles, I just read this excellent book. In fact, we do this pretty regularly, share these books around the office. You got to read this thing. Mm-hmm. Or here was an excellent experience I had with this restaurant. You'll love it. You'll take your wife, enjoy it. 50% would use the business more frequently, and I can certainly attest to this fact. I would use it as well. So the customer experience is something that we all know very familiar, and so it's very familiar to us. We all know it very well. But what's happening right now is that there's a huge emphasis being placed on that customer experience. When I rented that car, what was it about, etc. And we're saying that maybe the focus should be a little bit different. And the reason I say that is because we're trying to address the problem or the symptom of the problem, mm-hmm. but we're not trying to address the problem itself. So, you and I have talked about some examples of poor experiences with, say, renting a car or a hotel or a restaurant or something like this. And really what it comes down to is not my experience with that organization, but quite often my experience with an employee within that organization.
Yeah.
So we love this phrase. This comes from the Indiana Jones movie where they're trying to look at the staff, and they're trying to measure and identify where the arc is hidden.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they're doing is they use a staff to be able to identify what that looks like. And all of a sudden, the Indy and his assistant look at each other and realize that the staff that they've been using to measure this stick is actually a different size than what it needs to be. And they look at each other and they realize we're digging in the wrong place.
Right.
We use this phrase because with the customer experience, I believe very strongly that what we're doing is digging in the wrong place. So instead of addressing the heart of the issue, what we're really addressing is a symptom here.
Yeah, because many organizations are so focused, especially if you're a customer-focused organization or company, you want your employees to put their best foot forward and to create these great customer experiences.
Exactly.
And so there's a lot of operations is usually involved with this in marketing because they're looking at what processes we have in place, how do we fix these little broken steps or pieces that we have so that every employee is replicating a great customer experience every time.
Very good. So I call into a call center for technical support, and call centers are famous for this, for poor levels of customer support, even though they try to do very well.
Yeah.
And are working on this. So within that call center, they've probably taken great efforts to focus on the customer.
Yeah.
Given what we see today. What they're not focusing on is understanding the idea that that customer experience is really a one-on-one experience. So my experience with the call center, when I call for technical support, is actually not really with the company itself. It's with the individual that I speak with in that company. As you mentioned, it's individuals that make products, that put those products out.
And so if you're trying to focus on Six Sigmatizing a process to provide excellent customer service, you can only get so far.
Yeah, and Six Sigma certainly makes a big difference. I'm a big fan, the idea of taking a look at the processes that exist. But processes are implemented by humans.
Yeah, we're full of faults.
Full of faults, exactly right. And granted, many processes are automated, but ultimately when it comes down to the customer experience, more often than not, it deals with that employee. Because of that, we say you're digging in the wrong place. Rather than addressing the symptom of the problem, let's take a look at the actual heart of that problem. Now, we're talking about problems here, and what I want to do is change this emphasis to let's focus on how employees can create a positive customer experience. So I'm going to introduce the concept, just kind of tease it right now, of what about the employee experience? What would happen if we put the same level of emphasis into the employee experience as we put with the customer experience? Ultimately, that would lead to a delighted customer.
Yeah, so what would your employees tell others about your organization?
Yeah, if I were to go to an employee of the organization, what would that person say about the place where they work?
What kind of online reviews would you get?
Exactly. And by the way, the same way that you're posting Amazon reviews today, you're starting to see that same ability to post a review about your organization.
Yeah.
So the idea here is about the employee experience. What does the employee experience tell us? Well, let me just give you some statistics right now. First of all, one of the things when it comes to customer experience was the idea of the Net Promoter Score. I love this idea. Introduced first of all in 2003, and based on a single question such as, how likely are you to recommend XYZ company to others? So I go and rent a rental car. I receive a survey, and it has a single question or 2 or 3 questions. or I fly an airline or dine at a restaurant, and they say, how likely are you to recommend XYZ restaurant to the others that you deal with? And from that, they come up with a Net Promoter Score. Now, we've also taken that and said, what if we applied that same concept to the employees? What if we were to ask them a single question, such as, I would recommend this company to work for? We call this the internal promoter ratio. The internal promoter ratio would be asking the similar single question. I would recommend XYZ company to others as a great place to work. Now, we have calculated, and this is based off of how many survey responses now at this point?
We've got over 20 million in our database.
Over 20 million responses.
Yeah.
So this is not a small database by any stretch. We have found that internal promoter ratio to be about 6.27 promoters to every detractor. So as you walk down the hall, on average, you're seeing 6.2 people that would go out and actively promote your company, saying great things about it, saying they would recommend it, versus one detractor here.
That seems pretty good, but if you think about it, 1 out of 6.27, you know, you've got that many people in your organization, if you multiply that out, that are maybe saying negative things or aren't too positive or hip on their workplace.
Well, what I think is important here is when we look at that one person may be saying negative things, but the important thing that we're noticing here is the opposite. They're not saying positive things about the workplace.
Okay.
All right, so it's not necessarily that they're out there trashing the organization. It is that they're out there, and when someone says, "Would you recommend the company?" it's kind of an
Right.
Yeah, it's a a neutral response. Whereas their promoters are those who are saying absolutely.
Right.
Interesting ratio, 6.27 to 1. So that comes to the next idea that what would be different if we were to apply the principles that we learned from the customer experience? Okay, so there are a lot of these principles. Let's measure it. Let's understand it. Let's improve it. Let's talk to the individuals about it. What if we were to apply those principles to the employee experience? And the heart of this webinar is what would really happen if we started to see that employee experience through what we refer to as the employee lens.
Yeah.
I want to throw some statistics at you. The first one is one that we continually read, and I love to throw this out there. The reason I throw this out there is because we see it everywhere.
Yeah, so less than 15% of employees across the globe are engaged in their work. The vast majority of employees are psychologically absent from their workplace and are unlikely to be making a positive contribution.
Right, unlikely to be making a positive contribution. That means, and my math is not great, but I assume that's 85% of the people that are disengaged, according to the statistic, right?
Wow.
Now, we see this, every article that I see written about employee engagement, every blog
starts off with
this statistic, and it's usually from 1 or 2 organizations that put this out.
Yep.
Boy, every time I see this statistic, I want to ignore the rest of the blog, and let me tell you why. Do you really think that 85% of your employees are really disengaged in what they do?
Or they're not making a positive contribution? So what are they doing there, you know?
Sure, that's an easy way to get rid of 85% of your workforce right now. If that's the case, why are you not doing that?
Right.
Can an organization function with 85% of their employees not making a contribution?
Not at all.
It's not logical. Another thing that's not logical is the idea that, while you're on this webinar, where we have the people here on this webinar, understand that this is an hour out of your time and the inmates are going crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't happen, folks. And so the first thing I want to do is dispel a myth that exists here. The idea that 85% of your employees are disengaged in what they do is not accurate, and it comes down to really how those employees are measured. There are some days when I look at my job, and despite the fact that I truly love my job, I really do, if I'm on an airplane and it's the 13th hour of a 16-hour flight, at that point in time, if you ask me if I'm engaged, I'm probably not very engaged in what I do. That said, I am very engaged in my organization, and I am making a positive contribution. So one of the first things I hope that comes out of this webinar, if you're using those kind of statistics, stop and think about those. They're scare tactics.
Well, and the fact is that most people, I think, want to be engaged, and maybe I'm skipping ahead here, and most people want to make a contribution in their organization. And if you're finding that there's a majority that don't, it's usually a problem with the organization or how it's being run.
Exactly right. And you said in the majority in there too. That's nowhere close to 85%, first of all. And second of all, organizations just cannot stay alive if that statistic is even close to being
true.
Yeah. Just apply some common sense here. Like you said, people do want to be engaged. When was the last time you showed up at work and said, I hope today my job is horrible?
Right.
It just doesn't happen, right? Or you got on this webinar today and you said, I'm going to spend an hour of my time. I hope I waste it and I hope it's really bad.
Yeah.
That's not human nature. Human nature is that people want to engage. In fact, we run some exercises in some of the workshops that we conduct, and I've watched some of our senior facilitators do this. I love it. It is when they'll go in and they'll run an exercise that shows how people naturally want to engage in what they do.
Yeah.
And we find without fail that the vast majority of that audience is naturally wanting to engage in what they do. It's just human nature. So the popular myths that exist around 85% of your organization, or whatever figure that you hear, apply some logic to that, apply some common sense, and understand that that's not true. Now, that said, I do want to emphasize, I'm not saying that we have just a completely engaged organization wherever we go. In fact, our employee surveys, as you mentioned, it's over now 24 million responses, I believe, that we did a lot of research on. And this one happened to be what we finished last year, taken from 20 million responses. About 23% of the organization is fully engaged.
Yeah. And by that we mean those are people that are feeling
Sure.
Like they love their job,
Yeah.
they're really fully committed to doing their best work.
This is, I'm giving my heart, my hands, my mind, and I'm feeling this. I walk in there and you can kind of feel a team spirit and camaraderie that exists. That's with about a quarter of your workforce. That's 23% that is fully engaged,
Yeah.
right? Fully committed to what they're doing. The next category is where the majority fall. That's about 50%.
Yeah, so about half your employees are key contributors. We're calling them sometimes engaged, but they're the steady workforce that you have. They're not necessarily disengaged, but they kind of have these peak moments where they are fully engaged in their work, and sometimes they lapse back down into this other category.
Sure, and when we say sometimes engaged, I often take that word out of the webinar presentations that we do.
Uh-huh.
These employees are typically engaged.
Uh-huh.
So these are our strong and steady employees that come to work. There may be things about the job that they don't like, but for the most part, they're engaged in what they do. They're not disengaged. They're certainly not disengaged.
Yeah.
So as we look at those numbers, you're seeing, pretty close to 3/4 of your organization that is engaged most of the time.
Yeah.
This next group is also very interesting.
Yeah, so these are more of the fence sitters. They're kind of waiting to be engaged. They're not necessarily detractors right now, but 24% are in this opportunity group where they're not normally engaged, and there might be some issues that they're having to really get them on the right track.
Yeah, these are the folks that can engage if the environment is right. And right now, today, the environment is not right for them to engage. Now, these are not saboteurs. These are not people who are actively discrediting the organization. They're not people who are, as we read before, unlikely to be making positive contributions. They probably are. And the truth of it is we also have some pretty strong performers often in this group.
Yeah, it's funny because as we look at the people identified as the strongest performers in organizations, they sometimes or they frequently will span each of these different groups.
Exactly right. So the idea that a disengaged employee falls into this group, well, actually sometimes those folks are engaged. They're just waiting for the right environment, but they still may produce. So the idea of them not making an active contribution is false. This last group, however, these truly are disengaged folks.
Yeah, and luckily there's only 4% of the fully disengaged. Otherwise, you'd have some real problems.
We've done a lot of research on that group. And the reason we do that research is, number one, to kind of refute the idea that most of your organization is disengaged. That's not true. These are your fully disengaged folks. The likelihood of them leaving the organization and being disengaged in the organization they go to is very, very high. The problem is these folks sometimes don't leave the organization. They quit and they stay, and they corrupt. This is the disengaged population that also they're the loud ones. They actively promote and say that they're disengaged in what they do.
Yeah, happy to receive a paycheck, but not happy to be at the company.
Exactly right, and they let other people know about it. That's in that database of 20 million. This is not a guess. This is of your 20 million plus responses here. 4% is the disengaged category. Now, we have done a lot of research on tracking these folks, and what's interesting is we hear managers say, well, one of my responsibilities is to figure out how to engage these people. Based on our research, these people don't engage. So these people from year to year to year to year, and 5, 6, 7 years are there, and they're still disengaged from year 1 and disengaged in year 8. So the best thing to do is disengage them out of the organization, right? So they're no longer part of the organization.
Yeah.
So anyway, just some ideas to help you understand what the true state of engagement is in the workplace right now. I hope that as you're listening to this, that next blog you write or next article you read that starts off with your organization is disengaged, stop and think about it.
Right.
Disengagement is a huge problem, and it's becoming even more critical right now because especially as we look for other workers and the difficulty in hiring right now. But 85% of your population is not unlikely, I'm going to make sure I phrase this right, it's not highly unlikely to be making positive contributions.
Right.
So, that said, do we have engagement issues? Well, sure we do.
Yeah, and one of the big findings or problems we find is this question about speaking up without fear of retribution. So we find that 34% of employees do not speak up for fear of negative consequences.
Yeah, that's a third of your workplace. So when a third of your workplace doesn't speak up, what are you missing?
Yeah, I mean, it really kills innovation. It kills a lot of motivation to maybe take some risks and make some improvements. People end up not caring anymore because they feel like, hey, I would speak up and try to fix this problem, but there's no point.
Yeah. Retribution can take a lot of different forms. One of them is active sabotage. We find that that's highly unlikely in most organizations, but what we refer to as passive sabotage does exist. That's where I'm on the assembly line and something goes by and I realize it has a defect, and you know, I probably don't want to speak up, and the reason that is not because I'm afraid I'm going to get fired. In fact, I'd be complimented, but if I speak up, now maybe all of a sudden I'm the one that has to resolve that problem.
Right. Who wants to do that?
Yeah, I get more work. So, while engagement isn't what we're reading about out there, one of the things to be aware of is that within an organization, it is a concern. We may have a third of the employees who aren't telling us what they really want to tell us.
Yeah.
Now, are they disengaged? Not necessarily, but when we talk about the true meaning of disengagement, engagement implies some activity as well, not just a feeling. In that case, yeah, these folks are disengaged enough that they're not speaking up. I love this quote, the idea that to engage or not to engage, the idea that everyone wants to be engaged. Mm-hmm. And that's one that I just kind of want to make sure we continue to emphasize. Everybody wants to be engaged. We don't want to disengage. It's human nature in us. But the fact of it is some of us just simply don't know how. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to engage in this organization, or we don't know how to engage our organization, or the environment doesn't support it. So let's get some ideas from an expert here, Jack Welch.
So Jack says there are only 3 measurements that tell you nearly everything you need to know about your organization's overall performance: employee engagement, customer satisfaction, and cash flow.
Excellent. So I want to introduce again this idea of employee experience. Then we're going to go in and cover the concept of what we refer to as employee lenses. And then I want to introduce another concept, which is what we refer to as the contract, okay? The organizational contract. This is a basis for a book that's upcoming in the end of this year. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the concepts there, but I think you'll appreciate this. First of all, the idea of the employee experience. It's the sum of interactions between an organization and its employees. This is one of those that's best defined by the definition itself. The employee experience is the employee experience.
Seems pretty obvious.
Pretty obvious. It's everything that the employee experiences. That's different than just employee satisfaction, or even greater than employee engagement. It's all these interactions that I have.
All encompassing.
So back to this idea. The experience impacts the way that an individual thinks, feels, and performs. Yep. So the question, again, that we referred to earlier, what would employees tell you about your organization? What would they tell others? This is a concept that I want to introduce here that we referred to in the past as the lens. So if you consider a pair of eyeglasses and you put those eyeglasses on, if you see one of those lenses through the eyes of the employer and the other lens through the eyes of the employee, you may be seeing something completely different.
That's for sure.
Let's start first of all with the employer lens.
So the employer lens looks at things like finances, cost control, customer expectations, the larger strategy, what other employees need or feel. There's all those legal and regulatory issues, what's going on in other departments, economic factors, company future, direct new products. The list can go on and on. We just have 10 here.
Absolutely. So this is me putting on my lenses, and both those lenses are employer lenses. So as an employer, as CEO, as an HR manager, as whatever my position may be, in representing the company, here's really what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the overall picture from the lens of an employer. Now, is that any different than the employee lens?
Yeah, so as an employee, you're looking out for your own best interest. So things like healthcare.
Yeah, my own healthcare and my own health.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. Health.
I come to work and maybe I hurt my back yesterday.
Oh yeah.
I'm not possibly giving my all. It's not because I'm disengaged, but I'm seeing every action through that particular lens.
Yep. Their personal situation requiring flexibility, maybe scheduling, daycare, job advancement, personal interests, emotional and mental state, so work-life balance, relationships at work. So just the work itself as well plays a big part into that employee lens.
Exactly. So my lens is going to be different as an employee than it is as an employer. Mm-hmm. And what we're saying here is first of all, which lens is correct? Is it the employee lens or is it the employer lens?
Well, I mean, they're both correct. They're different points of perceptions, but they're both correct to each individual.
Right. So what I'm going to do is throw out another pair of eyeglasses here. And the concept here is what we refer to as the leadership lens.
Yeah, so leadership lens, you're looking at it maybe both ways. So the impact of employees on the organization, the impact of the organization on employees, the synergy between common interests, and then the overall results, their performance.
Yeah, this is the ability that we refer to as you have your leadership lens on. The idea to take both the perspective of the organization and the perspective of the individual. Many managers simply can't get to that point. We find this in particular with entry-level managers. All of a sudden, they're being asked to shift from the employee lens to the company lens or the employer lens, and they're not able to adjust both of those to where they're looking at it through a leadership lens. Because of that, the employee experience is not optimal, because we're seeing things through the lens of either employee or employer rather than looking at it through the lens of both. So I want to introduce this concept of what we refer to as the contract, okay? So this is, when I'm looking at it through the employer lens, I have one view of what contract I have, and the contract I have with customers, my employees, etc. As I'm looking at it through the employee lens, I see that contract as a little bit different. So we're introducing this idea of what is that contract. Now, the idea of a contract in an organization dates back to as early as 1950, 1960. The idea that within an organization there exists a type of contract. Some of those contracts are written, some of them are more mental or psychological or emotional contracts. So let's talk about what the contract is with an organization. Now, these contracts came from some of the research that we've done. There's a contract that exists, but is that all that there really is? Is the contract really simply what we sat down and signed on day one?
Yeah.
It's a lot more than that. This is based on a lot of our research.
Yeah, so getting back to MAGIC, the 5 keys to unlock the power of employee engagement, we looked at all the psychological literature that's out there and different case studies. We delved into over 20 million responses that we have in our employee engagement survey database. We looked at over 2 decades of research in 70 different countries, and then we looked at different case studies with organizations that we've worked with as well as others.
We found, as we mentioned in MAGIC, that there are really a few things that create engagement that we'll talk about here a little bit later. Notice it says 5 keys to unlock the power of employee engagement. We'll talk about each one of those 5 keys in just a minute. But as we published MAGIC, one of the things that we noticed pretty clearly is that, yeah, there are 5 keys to create engagement. How are those keys seen by the organization? How are they seen by the employee? When we look at those through the organization lenses, that may mean one thing. We look at it through an employee lens, and we may see something else. So let's talk about what we refer to as the contract. By the way, this is the basis for our book coming out.
Yeah, so the new book title, we've changed this in case you all have been following us in the past. It's called Bridging the Expectation Gap, 3 Contracts that Align Trust, Relationships, and the Employee Experience.
So the idea here between the expectation gap is that there are contracts that each one of us has with an organization. And what happens is we have gaps in the way we see our view of the contract through our lens and the employer lens, the way the employer sees that particular contract. Let's start with what these 3 contracts are. Go ahead.
So the first one is the transactional contract, which you were touching on before. Then we'll talk about the brand contract and then the psychological contract.
Yeah, every organization has 3 contracts. Every employee has 3 contracts with the organization.
I didn't know I had 3 contracts.
You have 3 contracts. And as we go through here, most employers don't realize they have 3 contracts. They realize they have 1 contract, and that contract has many different subfacets. But every organization, or every relationship for that matter, has actually 3 different contracts. Now, I'm going to use the terms organization and employee, but understand that these concepts apply to any relationship.
Yeah.
Could apply to a dating situation, could apply to a marriage, could apply to community, or beliefs that you have with that you share with a neighbor or something along these lines. Could be a religious organization, could be a club. All of these have certain contracts that exist that fall into these 3 categories: transactional contract, brand contract, and psychological contract. So let's start with the transactional contract. Charles, we ask this question in a workshop quite often. We question, what does a good day at work or school look like for you, and what do we typically see?
You know, most of the responses are, I'm able to get things done. You know, I'm not dealing with putting out fires all day. Some people might say not being around their boss is a...
Yeah, anytime my boss is in town is a good day.
Yeah.
Right? We hear that very, very often.
But it comes back to one of those magic components, which is the I in magic for impact. You know, having gotten something done, having made a difference in their workplace.
Yeah, I put this question out there. The reason I do that is because not so much what we are hearing, but what we're not hearing. So what are we not hearing in this?
So people don't say, oh, you know, I was really happy to get my paycheck the other day.
It was fantastic. A good day at work.
My 401k is doing awesome.
That's right. It's not a good day at work. Right. Another one that's an obvious one that may not be as obvious as we talk about this is, I felt safe today.
Yeah.
I came to work because I felt really safe. I came to work today because it was a good day because I had the equipment that I needed to do my job.
Yeah, my computer actually worked.
My computer worked today, so it was a good day. Now, we hear that sarcastically, but does that create desire for you to be at work because all of a sudden it works?
No.
But when we take that away, it causes disengagement. We refer to these as hygiene factors. The idea of hygiene factor is those elements that the possession of this does not necessarily cause me to be engaged or motivated, but I take these away, the lack thereof causes me to be demotivated.
Definitely.
Safety would certainly be one of these. Even compensation may be one of these, depending on what that looks like. Tools and resources, basic psychological security. That doesn't cause you to be engaged, but when that's missing, we become very disengaged in what we do. So the reason we mention this is because these are the basics. This is what is in the employer-employee transactional contract. Okay? This contract says on day 1, I join this organization, and in turn, I will receive certain things from that organization. It's in the employee handbook. So we might even refer to the employee handbook as part of the transactional contract.
Yeah.
It's the stuff that's written in that handbook that says, as an employee, you will receive these things. Oh, by the way, employee, you promise to give us these things. So some examples would be, I, as an employer, will promise to give you pay. In return, you as an employee have to give a day's work.
Yeah.
Right? So that transaction will be there. I will pay you. You will do a job. Also, as an employee, you are to keep me safe and out of jail. Right? So do the legal stuff.
Right.
Sexual harassment, harassment of any kind, illegalities, lack of ethics. Those are not accepted in the contract. And those are spelled out in that contract as well. They're spelled out in the employee manual. They're spelled out when we have orientation. In return, I will pay you. I will also guarantee that you will be safe in your work environment. That's part of the contract. I will guarantee that you have the tools and resources you need to do your job well. And those are the basics of the contract. Now, what people start doing quite often at this point is they say, yeah, you guarantee me growth. You guarantee me that I will make a difference because that's the stuff I want.
Sure.
And we look at that and say, wow, is that in your employee handbook? Do we guarantee you this?
Yeah.
Did we ever sign on the line this would happen? And the answer to that question is no. That's why it's a transactional contract. We guarantee certain transactions will take place over a period of time, and those transactions need to be honored. When you breach that contract, I'm out of here, or you're out of here because I don't let you stick around the organization.
Yeah.
The transactional contract are those things that we guarantee as an employer and as an employee, and often they're in writing, employee handbook or we sign a document. That's the transactional piece.
Sure.
Now, a relationship actually has a transactional contract. Basically says, look, if we're husband and wife, we guarantee that basically we're not going to be dating other people.
Right.
We're here together. That's part of the relationship. I will also treat you with respect. You will treat me with respect. We will treat each other physically well in terms of respect as well. And I'm referring to things like lack of abuse and things along those lines.
Yeah.
That's part of the contract. That's part of the basics. Just having those in place doesn't mean I'm necessarily in love with my wife, but that's basically the part of the contract, right?
Right.
Okay, that's the transactional contract. Now, what happens when that contract is breached? In an employee-employer relationship, what that means is one of us is going to go. I'm going to fire the organization, or the organization is going to fire me. And that's where we come up with this concept here.
Yeah, so this is where we get to expectation gaps and then trying to create expectation symmetry. I think we can all recognize that every contract and every employee-employee relationship we have is inherent with missed expectations or maybe different perceptions that create unalignment or these gaps. And so that's where, as a leader, your job is to help create this symmetry and bring it all in alignment.
Exactly right. With a transactional contract, what we try to do is eliminate any possibility of an expectation gap. So the purpose of writing this contract is, with the employee handbook, for example, is so there's no misinterpretation. You know if that contract's been honored or breached. So therefore, the objective of that contract is to make sure that the expectations are met, that expectation gap is not there.
Sure.
We call this expectation symmetry. So what does the transactional contract give us? Well, the transactional contract is not something that causes engagement to occur.
Right. It's really the basis. It's this employee satisfaction concept. So you can only, and again, there's a limited amount of employee satisfaction you can provide. Once I'm satisfied as an employee, more satisfaction isn't going to drive performance or make me, happier about.
You got it. So I'm an employee. I'm satisfied here. So it's okay. It's great. I'm satisfied. Am I engaged? No, not really, but I'm satisfied. Same thing happens in a relationship. Me and a best friend here. If we honor the basic contract that says, I won't hit you, you don't hit me, because we're friends, right?
Sure.
We're satisfied, but we're not all of a sudden happy because we're friends because we don't hit each other.
Right.
So I'm taking this to extreme, obviously. So that's what it means. Now, let's look at the next contract. That's the transactional contract, and honoring that in an organization gives us satisfaction. Now, the next contract is what we refer to as the brand contract, and this is something that's new. You don't read about this concept of the brand contract very often. I want to start with a concept that we refer to as EVP, or Employee Value Proposition.
So this is a set of associations and offerings provided by an organization in return for the skills, capabilities, and expectations an employee brings to the organization.
Good. So let's define the brand contract. The brand contract basically says that I, as an organization, or I as an individual, or I as an entity, profess certain things outwardly. So this is what I profess to be. This is my public face. This is it could be a facade, could be reality, but this is the way I'm seeing it. It's my image.
Yeah, and it's your image as an employer. So potential employees look at your company and say, wow, that looks like a cool place to work. Or, oh, if I get a job there, I know I'll be there for 30 years. It's a very stable organization.
Exactly right. So think of it in terms of referring back to customer brand. So customer experience and customer brand. The brand of particular items that you may purchase, it has a brand, and that brand means something.
Yeah.
That brand also carries over to the organization. So if I work for an organization, for example, if folks come to work for DecisionWise, our brand out there is that we are a company that focuses on employee engagement.
Yep.
So when our employees come to work for us, that would be what they would expect to have in the company. If I work for a company that is an outdoor equipment company, and that company professes that one of our responsibilities is to provide you outdoor experiences and work in world conservation, I expect that that's honored within the organization. That's my brand.
Yep.
Now let's look at a relationship. Charles, you and I are friends. One of the things that within our brands is that we share similar ideas, similar values. Families are both important to us. That's part of our brand, and that's what we profess. Mm-hmm. And because of that, we exchange a mutual relationship because of that brand. Think of it in terms of a marriage or a relationship that exists there as well. We bring certain things. So as I'm dating an individual, I would expect that this person would have these particular characteristics because that's what they profess.
Yeah, and if you find out that they have a criminal record or that they're a drug addict or something like that.
All of a sudden, that little cocaine addiction that I wasn't aware of before, that brand is just completely destroyed. Because I thought you were a pretty squeaky clean person when I met you. All right, so that's the brand contract. What's interesting about the brand contract is it's both explicit and implicit. What that means is sometimes I, as an employer, intentionally create that brand. But often that brand is created by people outside of the relationship.
Yeah.
So it could be affected by, I'm looking at our political candidates right now. Those political candidates certainly have a brand. That brand is intentionally created by those individuals, but it's also unintentionally created by the other people that aren't part of that relationship, right?
Yeah.
So the brand is something that we need to be aware of. When employees feel that that brand has been breached, they didn't get what was promised, then they're out of there. Okay, so a few things that come along with this. We don't need to read all of the bullet points, but to give you an idea of when you go through an employee life cycle, that brand is honored or dishonored.
Yeah, and it's seen during these certain points or events in the employee life cycle. So all the way from pre-hire to the exit phase, your brand is being communicated in certain ways to these employees. So the onboarding experience that they've had, the performance reviews that they get. That all communicates a certain aspect of your employer brand.
Exactly right. So if I believe I'm joining an organization that is autonomous, I have freedom to work where and how I want to, and so long as I get some work done, and then all of a sudden I'm sitting on my performance review and they say, I noticed you didn't show up at work yesterday. Well, that brand has not been honored, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yesterday I was heading to work and I passed two well-known chains. One of them a large supermarket, and the other one was a large fast food chain. And outside each one of these, they had one of those big signs, the A-frame signs that said, now accepting applications, and something to the effect that we will interview you on the spot and guarantee you an interview. And both those places had an individual sitting outside by that sign that would actually interview you right there on the spot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I thought, what does that tell me about this brand of the organization? First of all, I'm gaining an image of what to expect. They're desperate enough that they're sitting outside. Apparently, they've had problems not everyone getting interviewed in the past. So immediately, I established this image in my mind. So the point here is this brand is actually something that starts long before that contract that exists. Is we expect that I have this image of what the company is like. If I go in and that image is honored, then I believe that brand has been reinforced.
Yeah.
If it's not, then that contract that I had with the organization has been breached. Okay? So when we look at things through the employee lens, I have a certain view of the organization. The organization has a certain thing that they're trying to convey. And this happens in various ways.
Yeah, so if you're looking to join an organization or you're looking for a new job, you first might see their advertisement for the position, and then you fill out an application. And your experience is all shaped during these processes. So what did the ad say? And then when you went to go fill out the application, was it a difficult application process? Or was it quite easy and inviting? And then was the interview process good?
I love the story that you've told a couple times before about your daughter going in for this interview. I thought that was hilarious. Do you mind telling that?
Yeah, so she actually got a job at a local party place where they just had a bunch of games and stuff for kids. And she went in for her first day orientation, and she went to the cafeteria area. They said, oh yeah, come on in. We'll have you go through this 2-hour orientation course with us and get you all set up to work. She went in.
So she had her offer. And
yeah, she went. Yeah, she went in, sat down in the cafeteria. They told her to kind of go sit in the cafeteria. Went there. There's another boy that was being hired that was there too, and she literally sat there for a half hour and nobody came. And so she finally just got up and left because she was like, this is a joke. The place was a mess. It was totally, disorganized, and so she decided she didn't want to work.
So brand is family fun, come enjoy, exciting environment. Kids love this thing. She gets there and realizes, wait a second, this isn't what I thought it was.
Yeah, and
disorganized.
Right, and it was funny because even as a teenager, she recognized that.
Yeah.
And wasn't gonna buy in.
So I may show up on day one, which is what she did, or on the orientation, and all of a sudden my first 3 days of orientation are about rules and regulations, and that's not the brand that I signed up for. So what we're saying here is watch out for these chronological events, okay? These are chronological events that happen over a period of time. There are also events that we refer to as Kairos events. So when you look at the Greek for time, they're actually two words, chronos and kairos.
Yeah, so these are the opportune moments or intervals of time that represent a turning point, decision, action, or opportunity, a time when conditions are right.
Yeah, the Kairos events are interesting. We just flashed up the chronological events. These are planned events in employee lifecycle. It's a performance review. It's day one on the job. They're things that happen all the time. And the way we look at those through the employee lens and the employer lens is important to us. It creates that employee experience and reaffirms that contract, both the transactional contract and the brand contract. Now, Kairos moments, an example would be when I'm working for a company that's an outdoor company, and they tout how important it is that all their employees be engaged in outdoor activities, and we have some great examples of these in some companies we work with. But let's suppose that company, I say, hey, I'd love to take 3 days off here because I'm going to go mountain climbing with my family. Yeah. And that company says, no, you don't have any time off. Now, that's a Kairos event, right? So it's one that's not necessarily planned. It's an event that happens, and I sit down with my manager, and it's an opportunity to either breach that contract or reaffirm that contract, and honor that contract. Okay? So we've now talked about the transactional contract. We've talked about the brand contract. What happens when we honor the brand contract?
So this really leads to retention or employee commitment. People are committed to do their best work and stay with your organization. It's really how you retain your best employees.
Exactly right. So if that brand is honored, if it's what I thought it was going to be, if this relationship is what I thought the relationship was going to be, I'm committed to the relationship. Mm-hmm. I'm going to stay committed to this spouse. I'm going to stay committed to the organization. You and I have committed to stay as friends because it's the brand that we have. We're honoring that image that's there, and because of that, you're who you say you are. It's your public face, right? So we've talked about the transactional contract. We've talked about the brand contract. Let's talk about another contract. This is the psychological contract. This is a lot different.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to say, this is everything that's kind of underneath the iceberg, in essence.
You got it. So the brand contract, let's start with the psychological contract, the written stuff, right? It's mostly written. It's the things we both agree on. We may have signed it. It may be the transaction. The transaction piece. Exactly. Thank you. It's what we both agreed upon, and it's very, very clear. The brand contract is the image that we're both portraying. Okay? I may, as an employee, have an image as well. You thought I was an excellent coder when we came in here because I went to X coding school. That's a brand that I have. You get in there and find out I don't know what I'm talking about. That's a brand that's been dishonored. And what that creates is a commitment between both of us, right? We're committed. Psychological contract, as you just mentioned, it's kind of what's beneath the surface of the iceberg. It's the stuff that we may or may not have talked about, but it's expectations that I may have psychologically. These are expectations that we may not have written down. They're expectations that weren't part of the public image, but as an employee in this company or in this relationship, there are certain things that I expect that we didn't write down. Yeah. These are certain things that I expect in order to grow and in order to be a better individual. These are elements that contribute to whether or not I'm engaged in what I do. Let's define engagement before we move on with this concept of the psychological contract.
So engagement is really a two-part definition. It's an emotional state where we feel passionate, energetic, and committed to our work. And then in turn, we fully invest our best selves, our hearts, spirits, minds, and hands into the work that we do.
That's the true definition of engagement. Engagement happens when we honor the psychological contract. So let's give an example of the psychological contract. We work with a number of organizations. I'm thinking of one manager in particular, excellent organization, wonderful organization this person works for. And during the first little bit, the transactional contract's very, very clear. It's written down. They have an employee handbook. It's an awesome employee handbook, by the way, because it doesn't just list all the policies. It's really, really an awesome transactional contract. It's being honored in the organization. So, and the manager sat down he has 5 direct reports. And for some reason, these direct reports aren't engaged in what they're doing. So he's trying to figure out why they're not engaged. He says, are we doing everything we promised? Yeah, absolutely, we are. Here's the employee handbook. They're getting their pay. In fact, they're getting paid very well, above market rate. So the transactional contract's honored. Yeah. The brand contract's also honored. This is an excellent organization these folks are working for. They joined up and they're getting exactly what that brand said they would be on both ends. The employee is everything the employees said they would be. The organization is everything that they profess to be. It was excellent. So the manager's coming to me and saying, so why isn't my team engaged? We're taking care of this stuff. So he's wanting to look at it through a leader lens and not seeing what it is. Well, it's really the psychological contract. When we sat down with that manager's employees and had that manager sit down with those employees, he was asking the question, so what's missing? And the answers that they were giving were not pay answers. They weren't about the company answers. They were answers such as, I just feel like I'm stagnating in what I'm doing. Or I feel like I'm coming to work every day and I'm not doing the things that I need to be doing. I'm not creating a difference or making something happen. Well, that's because the psychological contract isn't being honored. So the elements of the psychological contract take us back to the idea of what we referred to earlier in MAGIC. And MAGIC stands for the following.
Yeah, so it's meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection.
Yeah, when I looked at those employees, what was happening is they had a psychological contract with the organization that said, yeah, you promised me all these things and you're honoring those, but really what I wanted were these things that we had talked about. I want to feel like I'm growing. I want to feel like I own the process and I'm making a difference. And oh, by the way, I want to feel like I'm part of this organization. Now, that wasn't part of the transactional contract, wasn't part of the brand contract, but it's part of the psychological contract. So let's go through the elements of MAGIC. The first one being meaning.
Yeah, so your work has purpose beyond the job itself.
Okay, when I go to a job, I want to feel like it's more than just a job. I want to feel like there's a reason for being here.
Yeah.
So one of the things we found out with those employees, even though the first two contracts were honored, they had a psychological contract they thought was being breached. They didn't feel like there was any reason for doing the job they did. They came to work, and two of them were actually developers. They were developing code. And then we had a couple of others that were project managers. And they just didn't feel like it had any reason. There was no purpose behind what they were doing.
Yeah.
That's the first element, meaning. So by the way, these are the 5 keys to engagement that we talked about in MAGIC. Let's talk about the second one. The second one is autonomy.
So this is really the power to shape your work and environment in ways that allow you to perform at your best.
So what are some examples of autonomy? It doesn't necessarily mean you have, in fact, it doesn't mean it's anarchy, right?
Right. So with autonomy, you want to provide some structure for people, but you also want to give them some ability to make some decisions, either about maybe where they work, spatial autonomy, who they work with, social autonomy, how they perform their work in the best way, and then when they perform their work, their scheduling.
Yeah.
In most cases.
Great conversation between the manager and his employees happened. The employee sat down with the manager and said, we appreciate the fact that you give us freedom to do things, but at the same time, you're checking on us. In fact, they made a joke about it because the manager apparently had written down in his planner to walk around and create relationships. And the reason they knew that is because every day at a certain point in time, he would make hourly scheduled visits, 3 of those every day.
Oh, man,
they felt very prescribed connection, right?
Right.
They felt that what was going on here was they were being checked on. So they didn't have that ability. It wasn't even necessarily micromanaged. There was lack of trust that exists.
Right.
So there's now a misalignment or an expectation gap that exists. The employees expected one thing and got another thing. The next one, growth.
So this is being stretched and challenged in ways that result in personal and professional progress.
This is where the employee says, hey, I love my job, I really do, but I've been there, done that. I've been doing this for the last 3 years, and it's the same. I'm not necessarily being stretched. Now, was that in the employee handbook?
No.
It wasn't. In fact, a lot of times that's not in the brand. Now, some companies actually use that in the brand. Come join us, and you will grow professionally. This particular company didn't, but it was in the psychological contract. It is what I felt I was going to need from an organization, but we never really talked about it. This manager, although he sat down with the employees and had performance conversations, they were all growth conversations were centered on how you can do better on your job.
Yeah.
They weren't ever centered on, but what does that look like for you? Where do you want to grow? Where do you want to make that happen? So the psychological contract was breached with growth.
Impact is about seeing positive and worthwhile outcomes and results from your work.
Yeah, have you ever worked in a position, I can't say that over the last 20 years in professional positions I've experienced this as much, but in some other positions I felt like I would work all day long and I wouldn't see any results. I never knew why I was doing this job.
Yeah.
In this case, these employees did feel like they were having impact. They felt like they were having a lot of impact. So that part of the psychological contract had expectation symmetry. What I expected was exactly what I got. But many organizations don't have this. There's that big expectation gap that exists. I don't feel like I'm doing anything. It doesn't make any difference. So you can see how this also connects with what we talked about earlier with meaning and purpose also. This is the result of that work. Finally, the last key within magic in the psychological contract.
So connection is all about the sense of belonging to something greater than yourself.
Good. So examples of connection. Does this mean I have a best friend at work? It could, right?
Yeah, that's part of it, but it might mean you also have a good relationship with your manager. But some of it gets back to this conversation about the brand of the company. You know, do you like the brand? Do you associate with that brand? Is that part of your identity? Do you feel like you really belong in this organization? There's a good fit there. These things contribute to connection.
So a few different levels within the connection piece. You know, I can feel like I belong to the organization. It feels like, yeah, I feel comfortable here. It's part of me, right? I belong to this. But when I really integrate with that organization, that is, look, I integrate with the mission. It's part of me, and I am part of the organization. We're connected. That sense of connection there. These individuals did not feel connected to the organization. And the reason that was because they felt like basically what they were cogs in this machine, and they weren't part of the overall picture.
Yeah.
They got along very well with each other, so that piece of connection was there. But as far as connecting with the vision of the organization, even though it was a great brand, they felt disconnected from that. They couldn't participate in that brand very well. That's the connection piece, and those are the 5 keys of employee engagement. Those keys are part of the psychological contract, that contract being honored or breached. That contract is also renegotiated quite often as well, and that's okay. The psychological contract can be renegotiated. That one can even be breached so long as it's honored over the long term.
Yeah, and some of those keys differ for each employee, so you don't need to necessarily have them be at 100% on each of the 5 keys. Maybe impact is most important, or maybe connection is. And so as a manager, you can understand that as you talk to them individually and find out what really makes them tick.
You got it. So what do we do? Well, a few things to focus on in terms of this, what we brought to the webinar. First one is think and measure employee experience. You're measuring customer experience in many cases. Some of you are doing employee surveys. Are you really measuring the employee experience? Are you measuring engagement or just the transactional piece of this?
Right.
The next piece is to understand the impact of the contract. Now, when we say the contract, we're actually referring to 3 separate contracts: the transactional contract, the brand contract, and the psychological contract. Understand, as you look through the lens of those employees, what they're seeing with each one of those contracts. The next one is really important.
Yeah, so watching out for expectation gaps. And I think we find that all organizations have them to one extent or another, but really the way you handle them is how you increase this trust and respect and relationship that you have with your employees.
Are those expectations explicit, even the psychological contract? We try to surface those so we understand what they are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's part of a manager's job, is to really get on the same page with their employees.
Right, which is start seeing things through that employee lens. Use the leadership lens and seeing both, but understand what it says from the employee lens. That comes to the next one, which is identify what are those chronological and also Kairos moments that exist in an organization, and understand that, hey, did I just breach this contract based on that interaction, or did I reinforce that? Did I honor that contract? Then the last one is bring the magic, meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. So Charles, that's basically what we have in terms of honoring this contract and bridging that expectation gap that exists that's in there.
Yeah, I think as we look at this, these are pretty easy concepts to understand, but I think they get forgotten a lot of times because as a manager, you're always struggling to kind of bridge that expectation gap between what your employer wants you to do, what management wants you to do, maybe new policies or things that aren't too popular with employees, and then managing the expectations of employees and what you need them to do to perform at a high level.
Good. So take a look at the book Magic, and then also watch for that book being released in 2016.
Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot more marketing around the new book, and so look
webinars, etc.
Look for some new content and materials around that. We also want to encourage you to join the Employee Experience Best Practices group on LinkedIn. I'll send an email out after our presentation here with a link to it. But we have, I think, a few hundred members.
Brand new group, right?
Yep.
Just started this last month.
And we really want to talk about these concepts in terms of how this employee experience is working, as well as these expectation gaps.
It's an open group. It's not a marketing group. Just go in and chat, talk back and forth.
And lastly, you can see at the bottom right of the slide the codes for HRCI and SHRM credit for today's presentation. I'll be sending out an email in the next hour or so with that same information, as well as a link to the slides from today's presentation. So if you have any questions or would like to learn more about employee experience, just feel free to reply to that email and contact me.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, all. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, great. And we hope you join us on our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.